My nephew stopped going to school over unpaid tuition. When I discovered the truth, I was stunned. I'm 38. I never imagined I'd find myself in this position, torn between protecting my nephew, Mike, and feeling like I've betrayed my sister, Lucy. The weight of my decision sits heavy on my shoulders, but when I look at Mike's sleeping face at night, peaceful for the first time in months, I know I made the right choice. Lucy and I were always inseparable growing up. Being 4 years older, I felt like her protector from the start. When Lucy got married at 22, I was over the moon for her. I remember standing beside her as her maid of honor, watching her eyes shine with joy as she said her vows. Her husband, Mark, was everything we could have hoped for: kind, devoted, and utterly in love with my sister. 8 years ago, when Mike was born, our family felt complete. I'd never wanted children of my own, but the moment I held my nephew, something shifted in my heart. "Wanna hold your aunt's hand, little one?" I'd whisper during our walks in the park. His tiny fingers would wrap around mine, and I'd feel this surge of protectiveness that I'd never experienced before. Everything changed 2 years ago when Mark's car accident shattered our world. I can still hear Lucy's broken voice over the phone. "He's gone, Sarah. Mark's gone. What am I going to do?" I rushed over immediately, finding her crumpled on the floor of their living room. 6-year-old Mike clutching her tightly, not fully understanding why his mommy couldn't stop crying. Our family rallied around them. I knew Lucy had been a stay-at-home mom for years, focused on raising Mike while Mark provided for them. Without hesitation, I stepped in to help financially. "Let me handle the bills for a while," I insisted. "You focus on healing and finding your feet." Lucy protested weakly, but eventually accepted. "Just until I can work again," she promised. For a while, it seemed like she was managing. She found a sales job, though the commission-based income was unpredictable. She'd call me with updates, trying to sound optimistic. "The job's going well," she'd say. "But you know how commission work is. Could you help out just a bit longer?" Of course, I agreed. Mike's well-being was my priority, and if my sister needed help, I was there. But then things began to change. The cancellations started, the avoided calls, the rushed goodbyes. Then came the night that changed everything. Lucy called in a panic, claiming her usual sitter had canceled, and she had an urgent work meeting. "Please, Sarah, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important." When I arrived, she was already halfway out the door, barely pausing to say goodbye to Mike. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what. Later that evening, as Mike and I sat playing board games, he grew quiet. "Can I tell you something? But you have to promise not to tell Mom I told you." My heart clenched. "Of course, sweetheart, you can tell me anything." "I haven't been to school in weeks," he confessed, tears welling up. "Mom said we couldn't afford it anymore, but she told me not to tell anyone. I miss my friends, my teacher. She always gave me extra time to practice my reading." I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The school fees, I'd been giving Lucy more than enough to cover them. What was happening to the money? "Does Mom not want me to go to school anymore?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. "No, honey, that's not it at all," I assured him, pulling him close. "We'll fix this, I promise." That night, after putting Mike to bed, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I contacted a private investigator. It felt wrong, like a betrayal, but I needed answers. The truth was worse than I could have imagined. The investigator's report landed in my inbox just days later, complete with photographs and detailed accounts. Lucy wasn't going to work. Instead, she was spending her days at a seedy motel with a man named Derek, a known drug dealer. The nights were spent at his club, where he conducted his business. The money I'd been providing for Mike's care was funding their lifestyle and her growing addiction. I felt sick. The sister I knew would never have done this. But grief changes people, and Lucy had changed more than any of us realized. Making the call to CPS was the hardest thing I've ever done. My hands shook as I dialed the number. "I need to report a case of child neglect," I managed to say, my voice barely steady. The investigation was swift and thorough. When they came to take Mike, Lucy's rage was explosive. "How dare you?" she screamed at me. "He's my son. You had no right." "Lucy, please," I begged. "This isn't about hurting you. It's about protecting Mike." "Protecting him? From what? From me?" Her laugh was bitter, unrecognizable. You just couldn't stand to see me happy again, could you? Had to ruin everything. Our parents sided with Lucy, much to my heartbreak. How could you do this to your own sister? Mom demanded during a heated family dinner. She's grieving, for God's sake. Grief doesn't excuse neglecting your child, I responded firmly. Mike deserves better. Better? Dad scoffed. Better than his own mother? Yes, better than being left alone for days while his mother hangs around with drug dealers. The silence that followed was deafening. The custody battle was more brutal than I could have imagined. Lucy hired an aggressive lawyer who specialized in family court cases. From day one, they tried to paint me as the villain, a childless woman obsessed with stealing her sister's son. Your Honor, her lawyer began in our first hearing. My client is a grieving widow who made some admittedly poor choices while dealing with devastating loss. But Ms. Williams here, he gestured dismissively at me, took advantage of her sister's vulnerable state to fulfill her own maternal desires. I gripped the edge of my seat, fighting to maintain composure. My lawyer squeezed my arm reassuringly before standing. If it pleases the court, she responded, we have extensive documentation showing a pattern of neglect that long predates my client's intervention. She proceeded to lay out our evidence piece by piece. The school's records of Mike's extended absence, statements from concerned teachers, the motel receipts, and testimonies from multiple babysitters about Lucy's prolonged disappearances. The judge's face grew increasingly grave as she reviewed the documentation. And the child's basic needs? She inquired. We have evidence that despite receiving substantial financial support from my client, Mrs. Peters failed to maintain Mike's school enrollment, proper nutrition, or consistent supervision, my lawyer replied, producing bank statements showing my regular payments to Lucy, alongside records of her withdrawals at locations near her boyfriend's usual haunts. Lucy's lawyer attempted to argue that she was actively seeking treatment for her grief, but when pressed, couldn't provide any documentation of counseling or support group attendance. Instead, he fell back on emotional appeals. Your Honor, what message are we sending if we punish a mother for struggling after losing her husband? This sets a dangerous precedent. The judge's response was measured, but firm. Counsel, we're not here to punish anyone. We're here to ensure the safety and well-being of a minor child. When the school principal testified about Mike's academic decline and sudden withdrawal, Lucy couldn't maintain her composed facade. She jumped up from her seat, pointing at me. You did this? She screamed. You turned them all against me. You've always been jealous that I had a family, and you didn't. Order. The judge's gavel cracked sharply. Mrs. Peters, control yourself, or you will be removed from this courtroom. The next hearing brought testimony from Derek's former associates about Lucy's presence during drug deals. One particularly damning account described her leaving Mike alone in their car while she went into the club. The witness, a former bartender who'd turned state's evidence, described having to watch the sleeping child through the window while Lucy was inside for hours. When the judge granted me temporary custody, Lucy's mask finally cracked. You think you can replace me? She hissed as we left the courtroom. You think because you can't have kids of your own, you can steal mine? I didn't respond. Her words were meant to hurt, but they couldn't shake my resolve. Re-enrolling Mike in school was my first priority. The administration was understanding once I explained the situation. The following weeks were a mix of progress and heartbreak. Lucy's boyfriend was arrested in a drug raid, but instead of using it as a wake-up call, she doubled down on her loyalty to him. He needs me, she insisted during one of our rare conversations. You wouldn't understand. What about who needs you here, Jenny? What about Mike? She had no answer for that. The supervised visits, when she bothered to show up, were painful to watch. Mike would be so excited to see her, but Lucy seemed distracted, checking her phone constantly, making excuses to leave early. Mom, look what I made in art class, he'd say, holding up his drawings. That's nice, honey, she'd respond, barely glancing up from her phone. After one particularly short visit, Mike crawled into my lap, something he hadn't done in a while. He whispered, Does Mom not love me anymore? My heart shattered. Oh, sweetheart, no. Your mom loves you very much. She's sick right now. Not the kind of sickness where you get a fever, but a different kind of sickness that makes it hard for her to show her love the right way. He thought about this for a moment. Like when Dad died and she couldn't stop crying. Similar to that, yes. But this time, she needs special help to get better. The final custody hearing arrived 6 months later. By then, Lucy's situation had deteriorated further. Despite the judge's explicit warning that her relationship with Derek could jeopardize any chance of regaining custody, she had continued to visit him in jail. The prosecution's evidence in Derek's drug trial had also revealed Lucy's deeper involvement in his activities than we'd initially known. My lawyer presented updated evidence. Lucy had missed 80% of her scheduled supervised visits with Mike, failed 3 mandatory drug tests, and hadn't attended any of the court-ordered parenting classes or addiction counseling sessions. Meanwhile, Mike's therapist testified about his remarkable progress in my care, noting how his anxiety had decreased and his academic performance had improved. In my professional opinion, the therapist stated, the stability and structure in his aunt's home has been crucial to Mike's emotional recovery. The court-appointed guardian ad litem strongly recommended permanent custody be granted to me, citing Lucy's persistent pattern of choosing her relationship with a known drug dealer over her child's well-being. When the judge granted me permanent custody, she lost control. "You've ruined everything," she screamed across the courtroom. "You're not even a real mother. You can't have children, so you steal them instead." The judge's gavel came down hard. "Ms. Williams, control yourself, or you'll be held in contempt." Now, months later, Mike is thriving. We've established routines, and he's in therapy to help process everything. His nightmares are less frequent, and his smile comes more easily. Last week, he brought home an A on his math test. "Can we put it on the fridge?" he asked hesitantly. "Of course we can," I replied, my heart swelling as I watched him carefully arrange it under his favorite magnet. As for Lucy, I still hope for her recovery. The sister I grew up with is still in there somewhere, beneath the grief and addiction. Until she finds her way back, I'll continue to protect Mike and give him the stability he deserves. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and I'm checking on Mike before bed, I catch glimpses of Mark in his sleeping face. I wonder what he would think of all this. If he'd understand why I had to step in, I think he would. After all, he loved Mike more than anything in the world. "We're going to be okay," I whispered to Mike's sleeping form, gently brushing his hair back from his forehead. "I promise." And we are. It's not the family either of us expected, but we're making it work, one day at a time. The path ahead isn't clear, but I know we'll walk it together, aunt and nephew, building something new from the pieces of what was broken. As I write this, Mike is doing his homework at the kitchen table, humming softly to himself. He's secure, he's loved, and he's safe. Sometimes that's all we can ask for, and sometimes it's more than enough.